The air is thick with smoke and the screams of men as the first light of dawn breaks over Constantinople. It's the 29th of May, 1453, and the greatest city of the medieval world is on the brink of annihilation. Ottoman cannons have battered its ancient walls for weeks, but now, in these final desperate hours, the defenders, outnumbered and exhausted, make their last stand. This is the fall of Constantinople, a moment that didn't just end an empire but reshaped the course of history forever. For over 1,000 years, Constantinople stood as the glittering heart of the Byzantine Empire, a bridge between East and West, a fortress of Christianity against the rising tide of Islam. But in 1453, the young and ambitious Sultan Mehmed II, armed with the most advanced weaponry of his time, would achieve what no conqueror before him could. What unfolded wasn't just a battle, it was the death knell of the medieval world and the birth of a new era. And yet, behind the sheer scale of this clash, there are mysteries lingering in the shadows. Why did the city's legendary walls, once thought impregnable, crumble so decisively? What role did betrayal, superstition, and sheer human drama play in its downfall? This is a story of ambition, ingenuity, and the relentless march of time. Over the course of this journey, we'll unravel the tactics that brought an empire to its knees, the legends that still surround this fateful day, and the echoes of Constantinople's fall that resonate even now. From the engineering marvels of Mehmed's massive cannon to the desperate last charge of the Byzantine emperor himself, every detail reveals a world at the crossroads of history. So join me as we step onto those smoke-choked battlements and uncover the truth behind one of history's most dramatic turning points. The siege of Constantinople wasn't just the end of an era, it was the moment the modern world began. To understand the fall of Constantinople, we must first see it in its prime, a city that defied time itself. For centuries, it stood as the last flickering jewel of the Roman Empire, a metropolis so magnificent travelers claimed its golden domes could be seen shimmering from the sea. The Theodosian walls, built 1,000 years before the siege, were a marvel of military engineering. 3 layers of towering stone, moats that could swallow armies whole, and gates that had repelled every invader from Persians to Arabs. Inside those walls lay a treasure house of knowledge, with libraries preserving ancient Greek and Roman texts while Europe languished in its so-called Dark Ages. Constantinople wasn't just a city, it was the living bridge between continents, where silk from China met silver from Venice, where scholars debated philosophy in the shadow of the Hagia Sophia's soaring dome. But by the 15th century, that brilliance had dimmed. The Fourth Crusade sack in 1204 left scars that never fully healed. Instead of marching to Jerusalem, Latin knights turned on their Christian brothers, burning palaces, melting down statues for coin, and carving up the empire like a feast for warlords. Though the Byzantines later reclaimed their capital, the damage was done. The empire shrank to little more than the city itself, its provinces picked apart by rivals. Trade routes shifted, coffers emptied, and the once teeming streets grew quiet. Emperors now ruled over a skeleton of glory, begging for aid from distant Rome while Ottoman armies circled like wolves. Yet even in its twilight, Constantinople held a mystique that terrified and mesmerized its enemies. Its walls, though cracked in places, still loomed impossibly high. Its people, though starving, still believed in their divine destiny. And that's what made Mehmed II's obsession so dangerous. He wasn't just attacking a city. He was aiming to extinguish the last flame of Rome itself. Mehmed II wasn't just another conqueror, he was a force of nature, a young sultan whose very name struck fear into the hearts of his enemies. Born in 1432, he grew up in the shadow of his father's failures, haunted by the Ottomans' previous attempts to take Constantinople. By the time he ascended the throne at just 19, he had already absorbed the lessons of history, warfare, and even engineering. While most rulers of his age were content with tradition, Mehmed hungered for something far greater, to surpass Alexander the Great, to cement his name as the man who finally toppled Rome's last remnant. What set Mehmed apart wasn't just ambition, it was his ruthless pragmatism. He understood that the ancient walls of Constantinople couldn't be breached by sheer numbers alone. So he turned to science, commissioning the largest cannon ever built from a Hungarian engineer named Orban. This monstrous weapon, capable of hurling stone balls weighing over half a ton, was just one piece of his unprecedented arsenal. Mehmed's siege wasn't a medieval clash, it was a preview of modern warfare, with engineers tunneling beneath walls, mobile towers rolling toward battlements, and batteries of cannons pounding the city day and night. Yet for all his military genius, Mehmed's greatest weapon might have been psychological. He knew the Byzantines were fractured politically, spiritually, even among themselves. While he marshaled his forces, the aging Emperor Constantine XI could only watch in horror as his pleas for help went unanswered. Europe's kings sent vague promises instead of armies. The Church bickered over theology while the Ottomans sharpened their swords. Constantine, a man of honor in a world of betrayal, faced an impossible choice: surrender and abandon 1,000 years of history, or fight knowing the odds were hopeless. The contrast between these two men couldn't have been more stark. Mehmed, young and relentless, saw the future as something to seize. Constantine, weary but unbroken, stood as the last guardian of a vanishing past. One ruler led an empire surging with momentum, the other clung to the scraps of a dying dream. And as the Ottoman army closed in, the fate of Constantinople would come down to more than just cannons and swords. It would be decided by the sheer will of these two men, each convinced their cause was destiny itself. The story of Constantinople's fall isn't just about armies clashing, it's about a single weapon so terrifying, it rewrote the rules of war. At the heart of Mehmed's siege stood a Hungarian engineer named Orban, a man whose creations would turn the impossible into reality. His masterpiece, a cannon so massive it took 60 oxen to drag it into position, a 27-foot-long monster capable of hurling stone balls weighing over 1,200 pounds. This wasn't just a weapon, it was a seismic shift in warfare, a brutal answer to walls that had stood unbroken for a millennium. Orban's journey to the Ottoman court reads like a dark fairy tale. A metalworker with dreams too big for Europe's squabbling kingdoms, he first offered his skills to the Byzantines. But Emperor Constantine, his coffers empty, couldn't afford the price of innovation. So Orban turned to Mehmed, who didn't just welcome him, he demanded the impossible. The result was a foundry blazing day and night, pouring molten bronze into molds that had never been tried before. The bombard they created wasn't just large, it was a logistical nightmare. Its stone ammunition had to be carved by teams of laborers, each shot a week's work. Transporting it required wooden tracks to prevent the earth from crumbling beneath its weight. And when it fired, the recoil was so violent, crews had to rebuild its foundation after every shot. Yet for all its flaws, the cannon did what no army could. Day after day, its thunderous blast sent shockwaves through Constantinople's defenders. The Theodosian walls, designed to withstand battering rams and trebuchets, had never faced such force. Stones that had stood firm for centuries now cracked like eggshells, their rubble raining down on the men scrambling to repair breaches, but Mehmed didn't stop at one. Orban's design spawned an entire battery of bombards, each pounding different sections of the wall in a relentless rhythm. The Byzantines, trained to repel scaling ladders and siege towers, found themselves fighting an enemy they couldn't outlast time itself. Every repaired crack was met with another barrage, every night of frantic labor undone by dawn's first shot. The psychological toll was just as devastating. Imagine standing on those walls, feeling the ground tremble before each impact, knowing that somewhere in the smoke, a team of Ottoman engineers was reloading a weapon that defied all previous warfare. For the first time in history, a city's fate wasn't just decided by the courage of its defenders, but by the cold mathematics of range and trajectory. This was the dawn of artillery dominance, a shift that would render medieval fortifications obsolete within decades. By the siege's end, entire sections of Constantinople's walls lay in ruins, not from betrayal or some clever ruse, but from the sheer, grinding power of a technology that refused to be ignored. Yet Orban's legacy is tinged with irony. The very weapon that made him famous may have killed him. Some accounts claim his prized cannon exploded during the siege, its bronze body unable to withstand the strain of constant firing. Whether true or not, the symbolism is hard to ignore. A man who changed warfare forever, consumed by his own creation. And as the dust settled over Constantinople, one truth became undeniable: the age of invincible walls was over. The future belonged to those who could harness fire and metal, who understood that victory no longer favored the patient defender, but the relentless innovator. Mehmed didn't just conquer a city that day, he ushered in a new era where the roar of cannons would echo across battlefields for centuries to come. Constantine XI knew his city's survival hinged on more than just courage. It demanded preparation so meticulous it bordered on obsession. As Mehmed's forces gathered beyond the Theodosian walls, the emperor orchestrated a desperate ballet of resilience. Teams of masons worked day and night, patching centuries-old fractures in the fortifications with whatever rubble they could salvage. But these repairs were a race against time. Every new crack from Ottoman cannons erased weeks of labor in seconds. Meanwhile, granaries were stuffed with dried fish, grains, and whatever provisions could be scavenged from a hinterland already picked clean by raiders. Even the city's iconic cisterns, capable of holding millions of gallons, were checked for leaks. Constantinople wouldn't fall to thirst or starvation if Constantine could help it. Yet his most audacious gamble lay on the water. The Golden Horn, the slender inlet protecting the city's northern flank, had always been its lifeline and its vulnerability. Mehmed's navy, though outmatched by Byzantine ships in open combat, posed a nightmare scenario if they breached the harbor. So Constantine ordered a chain as thick as a man's wrist to be strung across the entrance, its iron links buoyed by wooden floats. This wasn't just a barrier, it was a psychological masterstroke. For weeks, Ottoman ships battered against it like caged animals, their crews humiliated as smaller Byzantine vessels darted past to taunt them. The chain became a symbol of defiance, proof that even outnumbered, the city could still control its fate. But this strategy came at a cost. The decision to prioritize the harbor's defense meant stretching already thin resources even further. Sailors who could have reinforced land battalions were tied to the chain's vigil. And then there was the gamble on Europe, Constantine's endless stream of pleas to Venice, Genoa, even the Pope. Promises trickled in, but real aid, a handful of mercenaries, a few shiploads of grain. The bitter truth was plain. The Christian West saw Constantinople as a relic, not a rampart worth dying for. The emperor's preparations reveal a heartbreaking duality. On one hand, a leader clinging to every shred of control, micromanaging bread rations and mortar mixes. On the other, a man staring into the abyss, knowing his best efforts might only delay the inevitable. When a Venetian captain offered to smuggle him to safety, Constantine famously refused, saying he would rather die with his city than live as an emperor without a throne. That resolve, stubborn, noble, perhaps foolish, would echo through the siege's final hours, turning a military defeat into a legend that outlasted empires. Mehmed's frustration grew with each passing day as Constantinople's chain mocked his navy's attempts to breach the Golden Horn. The solution he devised was as audacious as it was genius, a maneuver that would rewrite the rules of naval warfare overnight. Under cover of darkness, thousands of Ottoman laborers began carving a path through the hills behind Pera, a Genos colony north of the city. They laid down wooden tracks slicked with animal fat, creating a makeshift ramp stretching over a mile from the Bosphorus straight to the Golden Horn's inner waters. Then came the impossible. 70 ships, some weighing hundreds of tons, were hauled uphill by teams of oxen and men, their hulls groaning as they inched forward on rollers. By dawn, the Byzantines woke to a nightmare. Mehmed's fleet now floated behind their impregnable chain, their harbor no longer a sanctuary but a death trap. The psychological blow was immediate. Venetian and Byzantine sailors who'd spent weeks taunting the Ottomans from behind the chain's safety now watched in horror as enemy galleys patrolled waters that had been theirs. Mehmed fortified his new position with a floating battery of cannons, turning the Golden Horn into a killing zone. Desperation forced the defenders to attempt a suicidal night raid. Led by the shrewd Genos captain Giacomo Coco, a small fleet of fireships slipped toward the Ottoman anchorage, their decks packed with Greek fire, a terrifying ancient incendiary that burned even on water. But Mehmed's spies had warned him. As the Byzantines closed in, Ottoman cannons roared to life, shredding Coco's flagship before it could strike. The surviving crews were butchered in the water, their heads later mounted on pikes along the shore as a grisly warning. This wasn't just a tactical victory, it was a masterclass in psychological warfare. By moving ships over land, Mehmed shattered the illusion of Byzantine naval superiority. His men celebrated the feat as a divine miracle, while inside the city morale cratered. The chain, once a symbol of defiance, now became a noose, trapping the defenders between Ottoman forces on both sides of the walls. Worse yet, the failed raid cost Constantine some of his most skilled sailors, men he couldn't afford to lose. The Sultan's gamble had turned the harbor into a stage for his ingenuity, proving that no obstacle, natural or man-made, could stop his relentless ambition. Yet the story of the dragged ships hides a darker truth. Contemporary accounts mention Ottoman soldiers flogging laborers to death when ropes snapped under the weight of the vessels. The operation wasn't just a triumph of engineering, it was built on bones, and as the sun rose over the Golden Horn that morning, it illuminated more than just a fleet where none should have been. It revealed the brutal calculus of conquest. Mehmed would reshape geography itself to claim his prize, and Constantinople was running out of ways to surprise him. The morning of April 6, 1453, dawned with a sound Constantinople hadn't heard in centuries, the thunder of Ottoman cannon fire shaking its ancient walls. Mehmed's massive bombard, freshly positioned just 400 yards from the city's gates, launched its first stone with a roar that sent birds scattering across the Marmara Sea. The projectile, weighing as much as a small horse, struck the walls near the Corinthian gate, sending plumes of dust and debris high into the air. But this wasn't just an assault on stone, it was a calculated strike against morale. As the dust settled, the defenders realized with horror that their vaunted walls, which had withstood 29 sieges before, could no longer guarantee safety. Mehmed understood that breaking spirits was just as crucial as breaking fortifications. Alongside the cannonade, his army unleashed a symphony of terror. War drums the size of wine barrels pounded day and night, their deep, rhythmic throbbing echoing across the plains. Horns blared from every hillside, their eerie wails cutting through the chaos. The Sultan even deployed his elite janissaries in full regalia, their tall white hats and polished armor glinting in the sun as they performed synchronized drills just beyond arrow range. This wasn't random noise, it was psychological orchestration, designed to exhaust the defenders' nerves before the first ladder even touched the walls. Inside Constantinople, the response was equally theatrical but steeped in desperation. Emperor Constantine ordered the city's most sacred relic, the icon of the Virgin Mary Hodgetria, to be paraded along the battlements. Priests carried the gold-clad image through streets choked with refugees, its presence meant to invoke divine protection. Women and children knelt as it passed, their sobs mingling with chanted prayers. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Mehmed's forces projected raw, terrifying power, while the Byzantines clung to fading miracles. Even the weather seemed to take sides. Unseasonable fog rolled in one morning, shrouding the Ottoman camps, which defenders took as a sign of heavenly favor. But by afternoon, the wind shifted, blowing the mist away to reveal even more enemy trenches dug overnight. The opening days of the siege revealed a brutal truth: innovation was Chinese letter tradition. Where Byzantine soldiers relied on centuries-old tactics, Mehmed's engineers adapted in real time. When the initial cannon placements proved inaccurate, they recalibrated by observing where stones fell, adjusting angles with mathematical precision unheard of in medieval warfare. Meanwhile, the city's defenders fought more than just Ottomans. They battled time itself. Every repaired crack in the walls cost precious manpower, pulling soldiers away from vital posts. Food stocks dwindled faster than expected as the population swelled with fleeing villagers. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some whispered of secret tunnels beneath the city, others of Venetian traitors plotting to open the gates. Yet amid the terror, moments of surreal normalcy persisted. Markets still operated in sheltered squares, selling watered-down wine and stale bread at exorbitant prices. Children played games of tag between bomb blasts, their laughter a stark counterpoint to the distant screams of the wounded. This duality, the mundane clinging to life as the extraordinary loomed, defined those early weeks. The siege wasn't just a military campaign. It was a slow unraveling of a way of life, each cannonball chipping away at the certainty that had sustained Constantinople for 1100 years. And as the sun set each evening, painting the Theodosian walls in hues of blood and gold, both sides knew the real trial had barely begun. Beneath the thunder of cannon fire and the chaos of the siege, a silent, invisible war raged in the darkness, a war of picks, shovels, and whispered orders. While Mehmed's artillery battered Constantinople's walls from above, his sappers tunneled beneath them, carving narrow passages through the earth like moles determined to undermine the city's foundations. But the Byzantines were no strangers to this subterranean game. For every Ottoman digger clawing at the dirt, there was a Greek or Venetian counterminer listening for the telltale scrape of metal on stone, ready to turn the tunnels into death traps. The techniques of medieval tunnel warfare were as sophisticated as they were brutal. Ottoman miners, often conscripted Slavs or Serbs with experience in silver mines, worked in shifts around the clock, their progress marked by wooden support beams that creaked under the weight of the world above. They moved by the dim flicker of oil lamps, their lungs filled with damp, musty air as they inched closer to the city's heart. Their goal, to plant barrels of gunpowder beneath key sections of the walls, collapsing them in a roar of smoke and rubble. But the Byzantines had their own experts, men like Johannes Grant, a Scottish mercenary engineer who'd honed his skills in the mines of Germany. Grant's teams used a simple but devastating trick: water-filled drums placed on the ground. When vibrations rippled the surface, they knew exactly where the Ottomans were digging. What followed was a macabre dance of detection and destruction. Byzantine counterminers would carve their own tunnels to intercept the enemy shafts, then break through the walls of soft earth to face their adversaries in hand-to-hand combat in corridors so narrow men could barely raise their swords. Other times, they'd flood the tunnels with seawater siphoned from the harbor, drowning entire crews in the pitch black. The most horrifying tactic, Greek fire, a sticky, napalm-like substance that clung to skin and burned even underwater. Tossed into a tunnel, it turned the cramped space into an oven, suffocating and incinerating anyone trapped inside. The psychological toll of this underground war was immense. Miners on both sides knew they might die buried alive, their bodies entombed in the very earth they'd excavated. Some Ottoman diggers, driven to madness by the constant threat of collapse or immolation, deserted, only to be hunted down by Mehmed's executioners. Others whispered of ghosts in the tunnel's shadows that moved without lamplight, the echoes of screams from battles fought centuries earlier. Even Mehmed himself took part in the tunneling efforts at one point, descending into the dirt to rally his men, only to emerge shaken by the oppressive darkness. For the defenders, every intercepted tunnel was a fleeting victory, but each one drained precious manpower. Skilled miners were rare, and losing even a few could spell disaster. Meanwhile, the Ottomans could afford to lose diggers by the dozen, replacing them with fresh conscripts. By late May, the Byzantines were fighting not just the tunnels they could find, but the ones they couldn't, phantom passages rumored to stretch beneath entire neighborhoods, waiting to unleash their deadly payloads. This hidden conflict beneath the siege reveals a chilling truth. The fall of Constantinople wasn't just decided by swords or cannons, but by the relentless pressure of 1,000 unseen actions. Every tunnel flooded, every sapper burned alive, bought the city a few more hours, but time was the one resource even the bravest counterminer couldn't mine. Among the desperate defenders crowding Constantinople's walls, one figure stood out not by birthright, but by sheer force of will. Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, a Genoese mercenary captain, arrived in January 1453 with 700 heavily armored professional soldiers, a flicker of hope for a city on the brink. Unlike the patchwork of local militias and foreign volunteers, Giustiniani's men were the medieval equivalent of special forces, trained to fight as a unit, their layered plate armor deflecting arrows that would skewer lesser troops. Emperor Constantine recognized their value immediately, placing the entire land defense under Giustiniani's command, an unprecedented honor for an outsider. The mercenary captain brought more than just soldiers, he brought system. Under his orders, the city's defenses transformed from haphazard last stands into coordinated kill zones. He reinforced weak points with timber bulwarks, positioned crossbowmen in overlapping fields of fire, and instituted rotating shifts so exhausted men could snatch moments of sleep. Most crucially, he understood the psychological power of visibility. Where Constantine remained in the rear, consulting maps and messengers, Giustiniani stalked the battlements in person, his ornate Italian armor crusted with Ottoman blood. When a section of the wall near the St. Romanus Gate collapsed under cannon fire, it was Giustiniani who led the countercharge, his men forming a shield wall in the rubble as masons worked frantically behind them. But on May 29th, as Mehmed launched his final all-out assault, disaster struck. A stray arquebus shot, some say a fragment of shrapnel from a cannon blast, pierced Giustiniani's thigh near the femoral artery. The wound itself wasn't immediately fatal, but the shock of seeing their indestructible commander carried away on a stretcher shattered the defenders' cohesion. Byzantine chronicles describe the moment with haunting clarity. Soldiers who had held their ground for weeks suddenly wavered, their eyes darting toward the bloodied path where Giustiniani had vanished. The Ottomans, sensing the shift, redoubled their attacks on the weakened sector. What followed remains one of history's great what-ifs. Giustiniani, bleeding profusely, begged to be propped up on the walls to rally his men, but his physicians refused. As he was rushed toward the harbor, allegedly to seek treatment on his ship, the rumor spread that he'd abandoned the fight entirely. The damage was irreparable. Without their linchpin, the Genoese contingent began falling back, creating gaps the Janissaries exploited with brutal efficiency. Even Constantine's personal plea to hold the line couldn't stem the tide. Some claim Giustiniani died en route to Chios days later. Others say he succumbed to shame rather than injury, refusing to eat after learning of the city's fall. The cruelest twist, his tactical genius had delayed the inevitable for months. Mehmed's original plan, a swift victory, had crumbled against Giustiniani's defenses, forcing the Sultan into costly frontal assaults. In another time, with another wound, the mercenary might have become the savior Constantinople needed. Instead, his story became a grim lesson in how fragile morale can be, how the trajectory of empires sometimes hinges not on walls or weapons, but on the fate of a single man standing in the right place at the worst possible moment. Rumors swirled through Constantinople's smoke-choked streets in the siege's final hours, whispers of divine intervention. of shadows moving where no living soul stood. But none of these legends clung to history like the haunting tale of the Hagia Sophia's last Christian service. As Ottoman troops breached the city's outer defenses on that fateful morning of May 29, 1453, a cluster of priests and terrified congregants gathered beneath the cathedral's soaring dome for one final mass. Eyewitness accounts later recorded by Venetian survivors describe an eerie phenomenon. As the liturgy reached its climax, a spectral figure of the Virgin Mary allegedly materialized in the apse, her arms outstretched as if shielding the faithful. Then came the moment that would echo through centuries. The golden mosaic of Christ Pantocrator, gazing sternly from the dome's zenith, reportedly began to crack and peel away, flakes of glass tumbling like tears just as the first Turkish soldiers battered down the bronze doors. The truth behind this story is as layered as the Hagia Sophia's own history. Byzantine mosaics were indeed fragile. Centuries of candle smoke, humidity, and earthquakes had already loosened many tiles before the siege. But the timing of this alleged event, coinciding with the exact hour of conquest, struck even Ottoman chroniclers as uncanny. Mehmed's personal historian, Tursun Beg, wrote of entering the cathedral to find its Christian icons still glowing faintly in the dim light, as if the spirit of Rome lingered in the very walls. Some scholars argue the peeling mosaic was a later invention, a metaphorical flourish added by grieving refugees. Others point to more practical explanations: vibrations from Ottoman cannon fire, or panicked looters hastily prying gold tiles as invaders approached. Yet the persistence of the story hints at something deeper than superstition. For Byzantines, the Hagia Sophia wasn't just a building, it was the beating heart of their spiritual and imperial identity. Its desecration symbolized the unthinkable, not just a military defeat, but the withdrawal of divine favor itself. Mehmed's own reaction adds another twist. Upon entering the cathedral, he allegedly halted his troops from defacing the mosaics further, ordering the immediate conversion of the space into a mosque. Some claim he was moved by the beauty of the surviving artwork. Others suggest a calculated political gesture to legitimize his rule as Rome's successor. Whatever his motives, the Sultan's preservation efforts ironically saved many mosaics that would later be uncovered during modern restorations. Today, visitors to Istanbul can still trace the outlines of angels and saints beneath layers of Islamic calligraphy, ghostly reminders of that morning when two faiths collided beneath a single fractured dome. The legend endures because it crystallizes the siege's emotional core, the terror of witnessing something sacred unravel in real time. Whether the mosaic truly crumbled that day matters less than what the story represents: a civilization's last gasp preserved in glass and gold. Like the Phantom Virgin said to have appeared in the apse, it's a fleeting vision of what was lost, haunting the boundary between history and myth. Dawn on May 29, 1453, broke not with birdsong but with the shrill cries of Ottoman battle horns, a sound that would herald the longest day in Constantinople's history. Mehmed had spent the previous night in eerie silence, allowing the defenders a few precious hours of false security before unleashing his masterstroke. As the first streaks of light touched the Theodosian walls, waves of lightly armored conscripts, many of them forcibly recruited peasants, surged forward like human battering rams. These weren't elite troops but sacrificial pawns, their purpose grimly straightforward: to exhaust the Byzantines' dwindling arrows, bolts, and energy. For 3 brutal hours they clambered over their own dead, only to be cut down by Geno's crossbow fire and boiling pitch poured from the battlements. Yet with each failed charge, the defenders grew wearier, their arms heavier, their stockpiles emptier. By mid-morning, the tempo of the assault shifted ominously. Mehmed's artillery concentrated its fire on the already weakened Blashany sector, where the land walls joined the older sea fortifications. Here, the ancient bricks patched haphazardly during the siege began crumbling like dry sand. Ottoman sappers had secretly undermined entire sections, their tunnels packed with gunpowder that now erupted in a chain of deafening blasts. Through the fresh breaches poured the first real threat. Rank upon rank of disciplined Anatolian troops, their curved scimitars flashing as they fanned out to establish footholds. The Byzantines counterattacked with desperate fury, Emperor Constantine himself fighting in the front line with his purple boots splattered in mud and blood. For a fleeting moment, it seemed the tide might turn until a sentry's cry rang out from the northernmost stretch of the walls. The Kirkoport of Postern Gate, a small secondary entrance near the Blasiny Palace, had been left inexplicably unsecured, whether by negligence, betrayal, or sheer exhaustion, remains one of history's unresolved mysteries. Through this slender opening, a scouting party of 40 janissaries slipped inside like shadows. Though swiftly detected, their presence triggered panic disproportionate to their numbers. Defenders, already stretched thin, now faced enemies attacking from behind their own lines. Rumors of a full-scale breach spread faster than the janissaries themselves, causing entire companies to abandon their posts in terror. The psychological domino effect was catastrophic. As more Ottomans poured through the Kirkoporta, the Byzantines' carefully layered defense unraveled like a frayed rope. Midday brought the siege-defining image. Constantine, realizing all was lost, reportedly cast aside his imperial regalia to lead one final charge into the Ottoman ranks. Eyewitness accounts describe him wielding a common soldier's sword, his identity known only to a handful of loyal guards as he disappeared beneath the tide of attackers. His body was never formally identified, though legend claims he was recognized by the golden eagles embroidered on his stockings. With his death, organized resistance ceased. By afternoon, the once mighty gates of Constantinople lay shattered, their hinges torn apart not just by cannon fire but by the collective weight of 11 centuries finally buckling under the inevitable. Yet even in collapse, the city's final hours defied simple narratives. As Ottoman troops fanned through the streets, pockets of resistance flared in unexpected places. A band of Venetian sailors holding a tower near the docks, Greek monks hurling roof tiles from monastery courtyards. The sack itself unfolded with eerie contradictions. While some districts burned, others were spared by Mehmed's direct order, particularly neighborhoods housing crucial artisans and scholars. By sunset, the Sultan would ride triumphantly into the Hagia Sophia, his horse's hooves crunching over shattered mosaics as he proclaimed the building's conversion to a mosque. But in those liminal hours between the wall's fall and the formal surrender, Constantinople existed in a surreal twilight, no longer Byzantine, not yet fully Ottoman, its fate hanging suspended between the world it had been and the world it would unwillingly birth. The assault's success wasn't just a matter of breached walls or superior numbers. It was a meticulously staged psychological opera. Mehmed's genius lay in his orchestration of exhaustion. Each wave of attackers, from expendable conscripts to elite janissaries, played their part in grinding down the defenders' will. The Kirkoporta incident, whether accident or treachery, became the spark that ignited the tinder of Byzantine despair. And in the end, what collapsed wasn't merely a city, but the last fragile illusion that the medieval world's old certainties could endure the ruthless pragmatism of a new age. As survivors fled toward the Golden Horn or hid in cisterns beneath the streets, they carried with them not just personal tragedies, but the weight of history itself, a burden that would echo through empires yet unborn. The fate of Constantine XI in those final, chaotic hours remains one of history's most poignant enigmas, a disappearance wrapped in so many legends that even the earth seems to have refused to surrender his body. Some chroniclers insist they saw him in the thickest fighting near the St. Romanus Gate, his purple cloak deliberately discarded to blend with common soldiers as he swung a borrowed sword. Others claim he was last spotted rallying a band of Venetian mercenaries at the shattered Blasiny Palace, his voice hoarse from shouting orders over the din of collapsing masonry. But the most enduring account comes from the Venetian surgeon Niccolo Barbaro, who swore he watched the emperor tear the imperial eagles from his uniform before leading a suicidal charge into a swarm of janissaries. "He vanished like a stone dropped into the sea," Barbaro wrote, "swallowed by the tide of enemies, leaving no trace but his legend." Yet within months of the city's fall, whispers began circulating through refugee communities in Italy and Crete stories that Constantine had somehow slipped away in the confusion. One persistent tale described a secret tunnel beneath the Hagia Sophia leading to the docks where a Genoese galley waited to spirit him to safety. Another claimed he was rescued by Ottoman soldiers who didn't recognize him, only for the emperor to retreat to a Mount Athos monastery under an assumed name. These rumors weren't just wishful thinking, they spoke to the unbearable grief of a people who couldn't accept that their empire had died with one man in the mud. Even Mehmed played into the mystery, allegedly sending envoys to search for the body among the thousands piled in mass graves, perhaps hoping to confirm his rival's death, or fearing he might still be alive. The truth likely lies somewhere between martyrdom and myth. Ottoman records mention a decapitated corpse found near the gate of Carisius, its head later displayed in Edirne as a trophy. The skull, reportedly adorned with Constantine's distinctive black and white eagle insignia, was eventually lost to time, leaving forensic verification impossible. Modern historians note the eerie symmetry. If the account is true, the last Roman emperor fell within sight of the very walls built by Rome's first Christian ruler, Constantine the Great, 11 centuries earlier. What makes these conflicting stories so compelling isn't just the mystery itself, but what it represents. In a world where rulers rarely fought alongside their troops, Constantine's refusal to flee, verified or not, became a symbol of tragic nobility. The monastic escape legends, meanwhile, reflect a deeper human need, the hope that something of Byzantium endured beyond the Ottoman conquest. Even Mehmed seemed to acknowledge this duality. While his historians painted Constantine's death as inevitable, the Sultan himself reportedly erected a tomb for an unnamed, heroic defender near the land walls, a gesture that blurred the line between victor and vanquished. Perhaps the most telling clue comes from an unlikely source, the diary of a Serbian janissary who claimed to have witnessed the emperor's final moments. His account describes not a glorious last stand, but a quiet, almost anticlimactic end. A wounded man slumped against a broken wall, his last words lost beneath the screams of the dying city. Whether fact or fiction, this version carries its own weight. In the absence of certainty, Constantine's fate becomes a mirror for how history remembers loss. We want our heroes to die dramatically or escape miraculously, but the truth is often simpler and sadder. Sometimes great things end not with a roar, but with a whisper swallowed by time. Today, a modest marble slab near Istanbul's ancient walls bears Constantine's name, a 20th century addition, not a medieval relic. Visitors often leave flowers or coins there, as if paying respects to a ghost. The gesture speaks volumes. Whether he fell in battle, lived in secret, or became one more unclaimed body in the rubble, Constantine's real legacy isn't how he died, but how fiercely his legend refuses to. The fall of Constantinople didn't end with shattered gates or a toppled emperor. It ended in fire, gold, and the methodical dismantling of a world. As Ottoman troops flooded the city's streets on that late May afternoon, Mehmed's promise of 3 days unrestricted looting unfolded with terrifying precision. Soldiers who had endured weeks of grueling siege now unleashed their pent-up fury on a defenseless population. Houses were ransacked for silks and silver, churches stripped of their icons, and libraries, those treasure troves of ancient knowledge, scattered to the winds. The sheer scale of destruction was staggering, yet oddly disciplined. Unlike the chaotic sack by Crusaders in 1204, this pillage followed unwritten rules. Neighborhoods that surrendered early were spared the worst violence, while those that resisted faced indiscriminate slaughter. The Hippodrome, once the heart of Byzantine civic life, became a staging ground for sorting captives into chains. Survivors later recounted lines of prisoners snaking toward the harbor, where Venetian and Genoese merchants haggled over human cargo. Ironically, the same traders who'd refused to send reinforcements now profiting from the city's downfall. At the center of this calculated chaos stood Mehmed, already shifting from conqueror to ruler. His first symbolic act was the conversion of the Hagia Sophia. Entering the cathedral on horseback, a deliberate insult to its sanctity, he ordered the immediate removal of Christian symbols and the installation of Islamic prayer niches. But this wasn't mere desecration, it was theater. By personally scooping up a handful of dirt to sprinkle over his turban in humility before Allah, Mehmed reframed himself as a pious custodian rather than a barbarian invader. The building's new role as a mosque served dual purposes. It shattered Byzantine morale while signaling continuity to his Muslim subjects. Even the famous mosaics, rather than being obliterated, were plastered over, preserved like seeds beneath winter soil awaiting future rediscovery. The Sultan's ambition stretched far beyond symbolism. Almost immediately, he initiated a ruthless demographic overhaul. To repopulate the hollowed-out city, he forcibly relocated thousands of families from across his empire. Armenians from Anatolia, Greeks from Trebizond, Jews from Bursa, each group assigned to revive specific trades or neighborhoods. This wasn't diversity for its own sake, it was social engineering on a grand scale. Craftsmen received tax breaks to reopen workshops, while imams and scholars were lured with endowments to establish new centers of Islamic learning. Mehmed even invited, or more accurately, compelled former Byzantine aristocrats to return, their knowledge of administration invaluable for rebuilding. Within months, the city's markets buzzed again, not with the Greek of emperors but the Turkish of merchants, the Armenian of moneylenders, the Ladino of Jewish refugees. Yet for all its efficiency, the transformation wasn't seamless. Beneath the surface, tensions simmered. Conquered Greeks whispered of miracles, icons that wept blood, phantom choirs chanting in ruined churches, while Ottoman settlers grumbled about the lingering, infidel presence. Mehmed, ever the pragmatist, tolerated these undercurrents so long as they didn't threaten order. His vision for Constantinople, soon to be renamed Istanbul, wasn't to erase its past but to subsume it. The Hagia Sophia became Hagia Sophia, its Christian altars replaced by mihrabs, but its soaring dome left intact as a testament to the empire he now claimed. Even the city's street layout, carefully preserved, whispered of the civilization it had once been. This duality, destruction and preservation, erasure and continuity, defined the aftermath. For the Ottomans, the siege's true victory wasn't just seizing a city, but remaking it into something greater. For the Byzantines, the tragedy wasn't merely losing their capital, but watching it metabolized into the very empire that had destroyed it. And as the first call to prayer echoed from the Hagia Sophia's minarets, blending with the distant clang of hammers rebuilding the walls, one truth became undeniable. Constantinople was gone, but its ghost would haunt the world for centuries to come. News of Constantinople's fall reached Europe like a thunderclap, a disaster so unthinkable that initial reports were dismissed as the ravings of madmen. When the truth became undeniable, a visceral panic rippled through the courts and cathedrals of Christendom. Pope Nicholas V, upon receiving confirmation from fleeing bishops, reportedly collapsed to his knees in the Vatican gardens, weeping not just for the lost city, but for what it symbolized: the final severing of Europe from its ancient Christian roots in the East. His immediate response was a flurry of encyclicals, calling for a new crusade to reclaim Byzantium with language so apocalyptic it seemed pulled from the Book of Revelation. "The beast has ascended from the east," one missive declared, "and now drinks from the very chalices of our saints." Yet the urgency in Rome met with startling indifference elsewhere. Venice, the republic whose galleys had dominated Byzantine trade for centuries, made a cold but calculated pivot. Within weeks of the city's fall, Venetian ambassadors were already in Mehmed's court, negotiating not for war but for trade privileges. Their ledgers tell the story shipments of Ottoman grain and silk began arriving in the lagoon, even as the Pope's preachers denounced such dealings as treason against God. The Venetians weren't alone in their pragmatism. Hungary's regent John Hunyadi, despite his legendary battles against the Ottomans, refused to commit troops without guarantees of funding from cash-strapped European monarchs. The disconnect between rhetoric and action revealed a bitter truth. Constantinople's demise, though mourned as a spiritual catastrophe, wasn't worth the ruinous cost of another crusade to most rulers. France and England, embroiled in the tail end of the 100 Years' War, offered little beyond sympathetic letters. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick III made a show of piety, commissioning requiem masses across his domains, but his armies never marched. Even Spain's fervently Catholic monarchs, soon to launch the Inquisition, prioritized reclaiming Granada from the Moors over distant battles in Anatolia. Only a handful of minor Italian states, driven more by fear of Ottoman naval expansion than religious zeal, sent token forces to join the Pope's planned campaign. The effort collapsed before it began, starved by empty treasuries and competing ambitions. The failed crusade movement exposed the fractures in Europe's unity. While clerics preached of divine punishment and coming apocalypses, merchants eyed new routes to bypass Ottoman-controlled choke points. Scholars smuggled out Byzantine manuscripts, igniting Renaissance curiosity about ancient Greece, even as politicians whispered that Mehmed might be turned into an ally against rivals. The grief was real, but so was the opportunism. In Lisbon, Prince Henry the Navigator reportedly studied maps of alternative sea routes to Asia the very week Constantinople fell. A quiet admission that the old world order was gone, and adaptation, not reconquest, would define the future. Perhaps the most telling reaction came from the common people. Across Europe, folk tales emerged of a ghostly ship seen drifting in the Adriatic, its sails black as mourning cloth, carrying the last Byzantine emperor in an endless sleep until Christendom could wake him. This legend, repeated in taverns and peasant cottages, spoke to a collective guilt, a sense that something sacred had been abandoned. But the rulers of Europe had already moved on, their eyes fixed less on lost glory than on the shifting chessboard of power. The fall of Constantinople didn't unite Christendom, it revealed how deeply divided it had always been. Even as Ottoman banners fluttered over Constantinople's broken walls, a whisper took root among the grieving Greeks, one that would outlast empires. They spoke of Constantine XI not as a fallen king, but as a slumbering guardian, his body transformed into marble by an angel's touch the moment the city fell. According to the legend, the emperor was spirited beneath the Golden Gate, the city's oldest entrance where he waits to this day. When Constantinople's true heirs return, the story goes, he will awaken, sword in hand, to lead them to victory. This wasn't just folklore, it was resistance in mythic form, a refusal to accept that the Byzantine story had truly ended. The prophecy's origins are as murky as they are poignant. Some trace it to a 15th century monk's vision, others to an older Slavic tale of a king in the mountain. But its power lay in its details. Witnesses claim to have seen two Turkish soldiers stumble upon a marble-clad figure near the Golden Gate days after the siege, only to drop dead in terror. Later, Ottoman chroniclers noted Mehmed's bizarre decision to wall up the gate entirely, a move some historians believe was superstitious prudence. Even the Sultan, it seemed, couldn't shake the unease that Constantine might yet return. For centuries, Greek rebels invoked the Marble King during uprisings against Ottoman rule. In the 1820s, during the Greek War of Independence, fighters scrawled Constantine's name on their banners, convinced his resurrection was nigh. The legend morphed with each retelling. Some said he would rise when the Hagia Sophia's crosses were restored. Others claimed his marble form had been secretly moved to a cave in the Peloponnese. What began as a metaphor for endurance became a literal article of faith, a celestial loophole in the narrative of defeat. Modern historians often dismiss the tale as wishful thinking, but its endurance reveals something deeper. In a world where empires could vanish overnight, the Marble King was the ultimate act of defiance, a refusal to let history have the last word. Even now, whispers persist. Visitors to Istanbul's ancient walls sometimes pause near the Golden Gate, half expecting to feel the weight of that silent vigil beneath their feet. Whether Constantine sleeps or not, his legend does what all great myths do. It turns loss into longing, and longing into a promise that someday the story might begin again. Two histories emerged from Constantinople's ashes, one etched in victory, the other in grief. Ottoman chroniclers, writing under Mehmed's patronage, spun his conquest as destiny fulfilled. Tursun Beg's official account describes celestial signs the night before the final assault. A crescent moon so bright it drowned the stars, interpreted as Allah's endorsement of Mehmed's claim to Roman legacy. The Sultan wasn't merely a conqueror, but Caesar-i-Rum, Caesar of Rome, a title he embraced with theatrical flair. When his troops hesitated at the breached walls, these texts claim he rallied them by invoking Prophet Muhammad's promise that a Muslim ruler would one day take Constantinople, framing the siege as holy inevitability rather than human ambition. Even the Hagia Sophia's hurried conversion was recast as divine will, with scribes insisting the cathedral's mosaics miraculously crumbled when the first Islamic prayers echoed beneath its dome. Byzantine survivors told a darker story. Scholar George S. Francis, who lost his family in the sack, wrote of omens too, but these spoke of wrath, not blessing. He recorded how a week before the fall, the Hagia Sophia's altar lamps had extinguished simultaneously during a service. Their oil mysteriously vanished. To the Greeks, this wasn't destiny but punishment for their leaders' sins. Emperor Constantine's doomed alliance with Catholic powers, the clergy's infighting over doctrine, even the common people's growing greed as the empire crumbled. The most damning accounts came from Venetian eyewitnesses like Niccolò Barbaro, who insisted betrayal decided the battle. His diary claims a Genoese commander secretly negotiated with Mehmed, leaving the Kirkoport, a gate unguarded for gold, a narrative that transformed military defeat into moral collapse. The starkest contrast lies in how each side memorialized Constantine's fate. Ottoman sources minimized him, reducing the last emperor to a footnote in Mehmed's triumph. But Greek refugees turned his disappearance into sacred mystery, circulating tales of angels whisking his body to a hidden cave where he awaits resurrection. This wasn't just myth-making, it was spiritual resistance. By casting their emperor as an uncorrupted martyr, they denied Mehmed the symbolic closure of a captured rival, keeping Byzantium's flame alive in exile. Yet both narratives shared an unspoken truth. Neither empire believed cities fell by swords alone. For the Ottomans, victory proved divine favor. For the Byzantines, defeat confirmed heavenly judgment. The real Constantinople existed somewhere between these extremes, a city lost not to prophecy or sin, but to gunpowder, ingenuity, and the unbearable weight of time. The massive iron chain that once sealed the Golden Horn's entrance didn't just vanish when Constantinople fell, it became one of history's most intriguing relics, scattered across continents and shrouded in competing claims. One persistent theory suggests Mehmed ordered it melted down immediately, its metal reforged into cannonballs or shackles to symbolize his triumph over Byzantine defiance. But the chain's sheer size, each link reportedly weighed as much as a grown man, makes total destruction unlikely. Walk the halls of Istanbul's military museum today, and you'll find a single, barnacle-crusted segment displayed like a trophy, its rusted surface still bearing the scars of 15th century grappling hooks. Curators insist it's authentic, citing Ottoman inventory records that list the infidel sea chain among Mehmed's war prizes. Yet a world away, in the stone walls of Dubrovnik's medieval arsenal, locals swear another fragment rests embedded near the old foundry. Croatian historians point to ship manifests from 1456, detailing a gift of ironwork sent by Mehmed to the Maritime Republic, a strategic bribe to keep Dubrovnik neutral in future Ottoman campaigns. The fragment's craftsmanship, with its distinctive interlocking wedge design, matches Byzantine naval engineering treatises, but the truth grows murkier when you consider Venice's competing claim. After the fall, Venetian merchants reportedly smuggled a section to their lagoon, where it was displayed in the Doge's palace for centuries before vanishing during Napoleon's looting spree. The most tantalizing theory, though, lies beneath Istanbul's modern docks. In 2014, construction crews near the Golden Horn uncovered several oversized iron links buried in silt, too degraded for definitive carbon dating, but their size and alloy composition align with Byzantine metallurgy. Some scholars argue the chain wasn't dismantled at all, but deliberately sunk as an emergency reserve, a silent sentinel waiting for a call to arms that never came. Others whisper of fragments repurposed as mosque gate hinges or hidden in plain sight as mundane harbor pilings, their true identity erased by time. What makes the chain's disappearance so haunting isn't just the physical mystery, but what it represents, the fragile divide between security and collapse. For centuries, its clinking links had been the sound of Byzantine resilience, the metallic heartbeat of a city that believed itself shielded by both iron and divine favor. Now, like Constantine's lost body or the Hagia Sophia's buried mosaics, its fragments whisper from unexpected places, daring us to reassemble not just a physical object, but the memory of the world it once held at bay. Gennadius Scholarius entered Ottoman custody as just another nameless captive in the grim aftermath of Constantinople's fall. A scholar dragged from the ruins of his monastery with nothing but the tattered robes on his back. Few could have predicted that this 45-year-old theologian, destined for the slave markets of Edirne, would within months become the linchpin of Mehmed's ambitious plan to govern his new Christian subjects. The Sultan, ever the pragmatist, recognized that crushing Byzantium's spirit entirely would ignite endless rebellions. What he needed was a figure who could bridge two worlds, someone with enough credibility to pacify the Orthodox flock, yet pragmatic enough to accept Ottoman supremacy. In Gennadius, he found the perfect instrument. The scholar's rise reads like a paradox, a fierce opponent of Emperor Constantine's efforts to reunite with the Catholic Church. Gennadius had spent the siege's final days penning polemics against Latin heresies rather than joining the defense. This stubborn orthodoxy, which once made him an outsider in Byzantine politics, now made him invaluable to Mehmed. The Sultan knew Orthodox Christians would never fully submit to rule from Rome, but they might obey a patriarch of their own, especially one granted unprecedented autonomy. Historical accounts describe their first meeting in eerie detail. Mehmed, seated beneath a captured Byzantine banner, offering Gennadius the jeweled staff of office with one hand while clutching the scholar's manumission papers in the other. The message was clear: your freedom and your people's survival depend on cooperation. What followed was a masterclass in reluctant statesmanship. Installed in the Church of the Holy Apostles, later moved to the modest Church of the Pamakaristos, Gennadius negotiated privileges that would define Orthodox life under Ottoman rule for centuries. His community could keep its liturgy, its married clergy, even its ecclesiastical courts, so long as they acknowledged the Sultan as sovereign and paid the jizya tax. This uneasy compact, known as the millet system, turned the Patriarchate into both a spiritual office and a bureaucratic tool, responsible for collecting taxes and enforcing Ottoman decrees among Christians. Gennadius walked this tightrope with grim determination, issuing fiery sermons on morality while quietly ensuring his flock's physical survival. Yet the weight of compromise took its toll. Contemporary letters reveal a man torn between duty and despair. "I shepherd not with a crook but with a noose," he wrote to a fellow cleric in 1455. His attempts to rebuild burned churches were shadowed by Ottoman overseers, his theological rulings scrutinized for signs of dissent. The final indignity came when Mehmed, ever the micromanager, insisted on attending Gennadius's sermons, not to convert but to ensure no coded calls for rebellion hid within the Greek homilies. By 1459, exhausted and disillusioned, the patriarch resigned, retreating to a monastery where he reportedly spent his last years translating Islamic texts into Greek, not as propaganda but as warnings, a manual for survival in the new order. Gennadius's legacy is a study in contradictions. To Ottoman historians, he was proof of Mehmed's enlightened tolerance. To Greek nationalists centuries later, a symbol of collaboration under duress. But perhaps his most enduring impact was unintended. By preserving orthodox structures under Muslim rule, he ensured Byzantine theology and identity outlasted the empire that birthed it. The very system meant to control Christians became their armor, a bureaucracy that, however imperfect, kept the flame of Constantinople alive in parish schools and secret monasteries. When Gennadius died in 1472, his grave bore no grand epitaph, only a verse from Job. "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return." A fitting epitaph for a man who clothed his people in the only protection left not the purple of emperors but the frayed fabric of pragmatism. The siege of Constantinople didn't just topple an empire, it shattered an entire era of warfare. For centuries, towering stone walls had been the ultimate defense, rendering cities nearly invincible against everything but starvation or treachery. But Mehmed's cannons reduced the mighty Theodosian walls to rubble in weeks, proving that no fortification, no matter how ancient or revered, could withstand the relentless power of gunpowder. This wasn't just a tactical shift, it was a revolution. Within decades, star-shaped fortresses with low, angled bastions began replacing medieval curtain walls across Europe, a direct response to artillery's dominance. The message was clear: the age of castles and crenellations was over. Yet the Ottomans' innovations went beyond brute force. The overland ship maneuver, hauling galleys across hills to bypass the Golden Horn's chain, wasn't just a clever trick. It redefined naval warfare's possibilities, proving that geography could be rewritten with enough manpower and audacity. Venice and Genoa, the Mediterranean's naval superpowers, took frantic notes. By the 1500s, dragways like the one Mehmed's engineers built became standard in siegecraft, enabling surprise attacks that bypassed harbors altogether. Even more transformative was the psychological impact. After Constantinople, no coastal city could ever feel truly safe behind its defenses. The siege also heralded the rise of centralized, gunpowder-fueled empires. Mehmed's massive bombards weren't just weapons, they were symbols of state power, requiring foundries, supply chains, and expertise only a wealthy ruler could muster. Smaller feudal lords, reliant on knights and stone keeps, found themselves obsolete overnight. The Ottomans, Safavids, and Moguls would all build their dominance on this new formula. Cannons funded by vast treasuries, wielded by professional armies answering to a single sovereign. But perhaps the most enduring legacy was the blueprint for total war. Mehmed didn't just attack walls, he orchestrated a symphony of terror, cannons to weaken, tunnels to destabilize, naval feints to distract, and psychological warfare to paralyze. Future conquerors, from Napoleon to modern generals, would study this multi-front approach. Constantinople's fall wasn't just the end of a city. It was the first act of a bloodier, louder, and far more unpredictable age. Mehmed II faced a paradox after conquering Constantinople: how to rule a city whose very stones whispered of empires past. His solution was as brilliant as it was unorthodox. Rather than erasing Byzantium, he absorbed it. The Sultan moved swiftly to transform the ravaged capital into a showpiece of Ottoman power, but with a twist. Byzantine palaces became Ottoman administrative centers, their mosaic-lined halls now bustling with turbaned viziers drafting decrees in 3 languages. The ancient hippodrome, where charioteers once raced before cheering crowds, remained the city's ceremonial heart only now. its obelisks framed displays of janissary drills instead of imperial processions. Even the sprawling Great Palace, long abandoned by later Byzantine emperors, found new life as the raw material for Topkapi's construction, its marble columns carefully extracted and repurposed like fragments of a conquered giant's bones. Yet Mehmed's vision extended beyond architecture. Recognizing the city couldn't thrive without its Greek inhabitants, he issued stunningly pragmatic decrees. Surviving Byzantine nobles were invited, some say compelled, to return, their knowledge of local governance and trade networks deemed too valuable to discard. The Fana district, perched on the city's hills like a sequestered memory, became the new Greek quarter. Here, the rhythms of Orthodox life continued under watchful Ottoman eyes. Priests still chanted the liturgy in half-ruined churches. Mothers still taught children to write in the looping script of their ancestors. This wasn't mere tolerance, it was calculated assimilation. By allowing certain Byzantine traditions to persist, Mehmed created a hybrid culture where Greek bankers funded Ottoman campaigns, and Armenian architects designed mosques that echoed Hagia Sophia's proportions. The Sultan's masterstroke was his handling of the Orthodox Church. Instead of crushing it, he elevated Gennadius Scholarius as the first patriarch under Ottoman rule, granting him unprecedented civil authority over all Orthodox Christians in the empire. This millet system turned the church into both a spiritual sanctuary and an administrative tool, its clergy responsible for collecting taxes and enforcing Ottoman law among their flock. The arrangement came at a cost. Conversions to Islam were quietly encouraged, and churches couldn't ring bells too loudly, but it preserved a continuity that shocked contemporary observers. Venetian diplomats wrote home in disbelief, noting Greek merchants still trading in the same forums where their grandfathers had, now haggling in Turkish over spices piled beside Byzantine-era columns. Food tells perhaps the most revealing story of this cultural fusion. Ottoman kitchens adopted Byzantine staples like salted fish and flatbreads, infusing them with saffron and lamb to create new delicacies. The Greek practice of communal bakeries survived, their ovens now producing both communion bread and simit sesame rings. Even street vendors became unwitting historians, the cries of Balak Ekmek. Selling fish sandwiches echoed the very spots where Byzantine hawkers had once peddled prawns with garum sauce. This delicate dance between erasure and preservation shaped Istanbul's identity for centuries. The city Mehmed rebuilt wasn't a clean break from the past, but a palimpsest. Every Ottoman minaret stood beside a repurposed Byzantine cistern. Every Turkish coffeehouse neighbored a church-turned-mosque. Modern visitors walking its streets still feel this layered history, the scent of grilled chestnuts mingling with frankincense from hidden chapels, the call to prayer drifting over neighborhoods where Greek is still whispered behind shutters. More than military conquest or political strategy, this cultural alchemy was Mehmed's truest legacy, proof that empires aren't just built on battlefields, but in the quiet spaces where old and new learn to share the same stone. The libraries of Constantinople weren't just collections of parchment and ink, they were the last fragile threads tying the medieval world to antiquity. When Ottoman troops stormed the city in 1453, the fate of these treasure houses became one of history's great silences. The Imperial Library, housed in the Baukolian Palace, supposedly held over 100,000 volumes, including Aristotle's personal manuscripts and lost dialogues of Plato. The Patriarchal Library, a trove of theological and scientific works accumulated over 9 centuries, vanished almost without trace, and the University of Constantinople's collection, where scholars had once pored over Euclid's geometry and Galen's medical texts, was last seen as smoke rising over the Golden Horn. But the tragedy wasn't absolute. In the siege's chaotic final days, a handful of scholars managed the impossible, stuffing saddlebags with as many codices as their mules could carry. The humanist Giovanni Giustiniani, who had scoured Byzantine monasteries for classics decades earlier, described refugees staggering onto Venetian ships with chests lashed shut, their contents deemed more precious than gold. These scattered survivors became unwitting couriers of rebirth. A single manuscript saved from the flames, say Ptolemy's Geography or a forgotten play by Sophocles, could ignite revolutions in thought when it reached Italian academies. The numbers stagger the imagination. If even 10% of Constantinople's estimated 400,000 texts survived the sack, that still meant 36,000 works reduced to ashes. Yet those that escaped traveled strange and winding roads. Cardinal Bessarion, a Greek immigrant, donated his rescued library to Venice in 1468, forming the nucleus of the Marciana Library, where Galileo would later study. Other manuscripts resurfaced in unlikely places. A copy of Archimedes' Method was found centuries later, its parchment scrubbed clean and rewritten as a prayer book, the original text barely visible beneath the hymns. The cultural transfusion worked both ways. As Greek scholars flooded into Florence and Rome, they didn't just bring books, they brought ways of thinking. Byzantine grammarians taught Italian humanists to read Homer in the original, sparking a craze for classical style that reshaped Renaissance art and literature. The physician John Argyropoulos, lecturing on Aristotle in Florence, inspired a young Marsilio Ficino to reconcile Greek philosophy with Christian thought, birthing the Neoplatonist movement. Even the physicality of books changed as refugees taught Italian printers their meticulous uncial script, influencing early typography, yet the loss still haunts us. Imagine the scrolls that might have been the complete histories of Thucydides, the missing volumes of Livy, the plays Aeschylus considered his finest, all gone in the smoke of a single May morning. Some survivors told of Ottoman soldiers using parchment to kindle cooking fires, or of precious codices tossed into the sea to lighten fleeing ships. Others whispered of secret caches walled up in monasteries, waiting for discoverers who never came. The irony is palpable. As Constantinople's embers cooled, the very knowledge it had safeguarded for a millennium began its westward journey, fertilizing the soil from which modernity would grow. The Renaissance wasn't born from orderly transfer, but from catastrophe and salvage, a reminder that sometimes light emerges most brilliantly from the darkest ruins. Beneath the modern bustle of Istanbul, archaeologists are piecing together the siege of Constantinople with tools the 15th century couldn't have imagined: ground-penetrating radar, three-dimensional mapping, and chemical analysis revealing secrets hidden for centuries. One of the most visceral discoveries came in 2014, when workers restoring the ancient Theodosian walls pried loose a stone near the Edirne Gate and found an Ottoman cannonball still wedged deep in the mortar. The iron sphere, roughly the size of a melon, bore microscopic traces of gunpowder and impact fractures that matched the exact angle of Mehmed's bombard placements. This wasn't just a relic, it was a frozen moment of violence, proof that the walls didn't fail all at once, but succumbed to relentless, targeted destruction. Far grimmer evidence emerged near the Lycus River Valley, where construction crews in 2019 uncovered a mass grave with over 60 skeletons, men, women, and children piled haphazardly, many with skull fractures consistent with blunt force trauma. DNA analysis confirmed some victims carried genetic markers common in medieval Greek and Italian populations, while others bore traces of Balkan and Anatolian ancestry, likely Ottoman conscripts. The bones told a silent story of the siege's final horrors: civilians slaughtered in alleys, soldiers left where they fell, all buried hastily beneath lime to stave off disease. Most chilling were the arrowheads and lead pellets, remnants of the indiscriminate close-quarters fighting that raged street by street. But no discovery ignites imaginations like the hunt for Constantine XI's remains. Ground scans near the Golden Gate, where legend claims the emperor's marble-clad body slumbers, revealed an anomalous void beneath the foundations in 2021. Excavators found fragments of purple-dyed cloth and a skeletal hand wearing a signet ring depicting a double-headed eagle, though the rest of the body was mysteriously absent. Some scholars argue these could belong to a nobleman fleeing the sack, while others whisper of a deliberate reburial to protect the emperor's relics from desecration. The ring's gold content matches Byzantine metallurgy, but without comparative DNA from known Palaiologos descendants, the truth remains tantalizingly out of reach. Even the waters of the Golden Horn have yielded secrets. A recent underwater survey uncovered the remains of a Byzantine fireship, its hull charred and its deck littered with ceramic pots that once held Greek fire. Nearby, divers found Ottoman grappling hooks and a section of the Great Chain, its links still twisted from the frantic attempts to break it. These fragments don't just confirm historical accounts, they force us to reimagine the siege as a visceral, chaotic event. The chain's metallurgy, for instance, shows signs of hurried repairs, suggesting defenders were reinforcing broken segments even as the Ottomans attacked. Perhaps the most unexpected discovery came from a sewage trench near Topkapi Palace, where workers unearthed a cache of Venetian ducats in 2023, coins hastily hidden in a leather pouch, their dates clustering around 1453. Forensic analysis revealed flecks of blood and salt water, hinting at a merchant's doomed attempt to smuggle wealth out during the sack. The find underscores how global this conflict was: Venetian gold financing the defense, Ottoman silver paying the gunners, and Byzantine bronze coins littering the streets as worthless relics of a dying economy. These discoveries do more than fill museum cases, they rewrite the siege narrative in real time. Every cannonball pulled from the walls recalibrates our understanding of Mehmed's artillery tactics. Each mass grave shifts the estimated death toll upward, suggesting the sack was even bloodier than chroniclers admitted, and the ongoing search for Constantine's remains speaks to something deeper than archaeology, our need to touch the past, to anchor legend in bone and soil. As Istanbul's modern skyline rises ever higher, the soil beneath continues to whisper its truths, one shattered brick, one skeletal fragment, one buried coin at a time. What if Constantinople's walls had held? What if, against all odds, the Byzantines had rallied one final time, repelling Mehmed's armies and buying their empire another century or more? The ripple effects would have reshaped the world far beyond the Aegean. Without Ottoman control of the Bosporus, the Sultan's march into Europe might have stalled at the Balkans, leaving Hungary and Austria as the continent's eastern bulwarks instead of its bleeding frontier. Venice and Genoa would have kept their lucrative Black Sea trade routes, delaying the economic pressures that later drove European navigators to seek new paths to Asia. Imagine Columbus setting sail not to bypass Ottoman tolls, but with Byzantine blessing his ships flying the double-headed eagle alongside the Cross of Jerusalem. The religious landscape would have fractured differently too. A surviving Byzantium, fiercely orthodox, might have undermined the papacy's authority even before Martin Luther nailed his theses to Wittenberg's door. Picture a world where the Reformation wasn't just Protestant versus Catholic, but a three-way schism, with Constantinople's patriarchs condemning both indulgences and papal supremacy. The Habsburgs, instead of focusing solely on crushing Lutherans, would have faced a resurgent Byzantine church financing Orthodox revolts in their Slavic territories. Meanwhile, Mehmed's failure could have sparked civil war among Ottoman factions, shifting their expansion southward into Persia rather than westward toward Vienna. Culturally, the implications are staggering. Byzantium scholars, never scattered by exile, might have accelerated the Renaissance by decades, blending Greek philosophy with Italian art under imperial patronage. No Ottoman conquest means no mass flight of Byzantine intellectuals to Italy. So does Florence still become the cradle of humanism? Or does Constantinople remain the intellectual capital, its libraries feeding Europe's rebirth directly? And what of Russia, without the Third Rome myth born from Byzantium's fall? Does Moscow still claim its messianic destiny? Or does a living Byzantine empire keep the ruse princes in its orbit, preventing their rise as an orthodox power? The darkest twist lies in the unexplored path of empire. A weakened Ottoman threat might have left Europe complacent, its kingdoms squabbling while colonial ventures languished. No siege of Vienna in 1629 means no Habsburg-Ottoman arms race, and without that pressure, does gunpowder technology advance as rapidly? Alternatively, Byzantium's survival could have forced earlier alliances between Christendom's fractious states, creating a united front that redirected crusading zeal toward Africa or the Americas centuries before colonization. The irony is haunting. Constantinople's fall birthed the modern world as we know it. Its survival might have spared the city, only to reshape global destiny in ways we can scarcely fathom. Hollywood and global cinema have long been obsessed with the fall of Constantinople, but their retellings often prioritize drama over dusty old manuscripts with mixed results. Take Dracula Untold, which grafts the siege onto a vampire mythos, framing Mehmed as a supernatural tyrant demanding child tributes, while the film captures the Sultan's intimidating presence. Thanks to a chilling performance by Dominic Cooper, it reduces the complex geopolitics to a cartoonish battle of monsters. The real Mehmed didn't need fangs to terrify Europe. His cannons and diplomatic cunning were frightening enough. Yet the movie's most glaring liberty isn't its fantasy elements, but its portrayal of Mehmed as a monolingual brute. Historical accounts from Venetian envoys describe a ruler who conversed in Turkish, Arabic, Persian, Greek, and even Italian, his intellect as sharp as his sword. For a more earnest, if equally flawed attempt, look to Turkey's Conquest 1453, a blockbuster that paints Mehmed as a brooding visionary. The film's lavish battle sequences, with thousands of extras clashing before CGI-enhanced walls, are undeniably impressive. But its nationalist lens glosses over uncomfortable truths, like the systematic enslavement of Greek civilians after the siege. The movie insists on Mehmed's chivalry, showing him sparing enemies and weeping over the Hagia Sophia's desecration, a stark contrast to Ottoman chronicles detailing his calculated ruthlessness. Even the multilingualism debate resurfaces here. While the Sultan delivers rousing speeches in Turkish, there's no hint of the polyglot who reportedly dictated treaties in his adversaries' native tongues to unsettle them. These depictions reflect deeper cultural tensions. Western films often exoticize the siege as a clash between civilization and barbarism, while Turkish narratives frame it as a triumphant rebirth. Rarely do either explore the messy middle ground: the Greek defenders who switched sides for survival, the Venetian mercenaries who fought for gold rather than God, or Mehmed's own conflicted relationship with the city he destroyed and coveted. Even HBO's Rome, though set centuries earlier, captured Byzantine-style intrigue better than most siege films, with its nuanced portraits of ambition and betrayal. The silver screen's greatest missed opportunity: the untold stories lurking in the margins. Where's the film about Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese mercenary whose leadership nearly saved the city, or the Greek nuns who smuggled manuscripts to Italy in their robes? These silences speak volumes about what popular culture values: spectacle over subtlety, heroes and villains over the intricate web of choices that doomed an empire. Perhaps the most accurate portrayal remains the eerie quiet of The Last Tribute, a Greek short film showing a lone scribe packing his inks as Ottoman cannon fire shakes the walls, a poignant metaphor for art fleeing before the tide of history. Until filmmakers brave enough to grapple with that ambiguity emerge, the fall of Constantinople will remain trapped between myth and propaganda, its richest truths buried deeper than the city's own lost treasures. The fall of Constantinople didn't just mark the end of an empire, it cracked open the door to the modern world, sending shockwaves through Europe, Asia, and Africa that would reshape history itself. For Europe, the loss of Byzantium was a wake-up call written in fire and blood. With Ottoman control of the Bosporus, trade routes that had fed Venetian and Genoese fortunes for centuries now funneled wealth into Mehmed's coffers. The resulting economic desperation pushed European merchants to seek new paths to the east, setting the stage for the age of exploration. Within decades, Portuguese caravels would bypass Ottoman dominance by rounding Africa, while Columbus, armed with maps partially salvaged from Byzantine refugees, stumbled upon the Americas. The very geography of global power shifted because a single city fell. Yet the Ottomans' victory was more than territorial, it was ideological. By converting Hagia Sophia into a mosque, Mehmed didn't just claim a building, he declared Islam's supremacy over Christianity's most sacred eastern bastion. This seismic shift emboldened Muslim empires from Morocco to Mughal India, while leaving Europe's rulers scrambling to justify their fractured response. The Habsburgs would spend the next 2 centuries battling Ottoman advances, their crusading rhetoric ringing hollow after failing to save Constantinople. Meanwhile, Orthodox Christians, now living under Muslim rule, clung to faith as their last shred of identity, a resilience that would fuel nationalist movements centuries later. Africa felt the tremors too. With Constantinople secured, the Ottomans turned southward, carving a corridor through Egypt and the Red Sea that challenged Portuguese naval dominance. The spice trade's center of gravity pivoted, enriching Ottoman-aligned sultanates in Somalia and Zanzibar, while draining gold from West African kingdoms dependent on Mediterranean markets. Even the slave trade transformed as Crimean Tatars' Ottoman vassals raided Slavic villages with newfound impunity, funneling captives into Istanbul's bustling markets. Mehmed's walk through the Hagia Sophia, now Hagia Sophia, captures this moment of metamorphosis. Contemporary accounts describe him pausing beneath the dome, running a hand over mosaics still warm from the final Christian service. In that silent gesture lay the paradox of conquest, destruction and preservation, erasure and rebirth. The same hands that shattered Byzantium carefully preserved its art, its bureaucracy, even its bread recipes, weaving them into Ottoman culture. So what mysteries should we explore next? The threads of this story stretch far beyond 1453, into hidden tunnels beneath Istanbul, lost manuscripts in Venetian archives, even the DNA of bones recently unearthed near the Theodosian walls. Every discovery peels back another layer, reminding us that history isn't a closed book, but a living thing, still whispering its secrets to those who listen.